I just want to check and make sure that you can hear me.
Yes, we are hearing you.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to welcome all of you to this stakeholder consultation on the draft voluntary standard TTS 665, effluent discharges from upstream and midstream oil and gas operations requirements. This standard establishes effluent discharge limitations with relevant test methods for key pollutant parameters related to end-of-pipe effluent discharges from upstream and midstream industrial establishments involved in oil and natural gas operations from onshore and offshore sources located within Trinidad and Tobago. This voluntary standard was developed to support the Upstream Effluent Management Policy, or UEM policy for short, under the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. The overarching principle of the UEM policy includes the minimization and ultimate elimination of treated and untreated upstream effluent discharge by utilization of an integrated management approach to ensure zero harmful discharge to the environment. The purpose of today's consultation is to highlight the key requirements of this draft voluntary standard and to solicit feedback with the aim of finalizing the standard. At this point, I would like to express my gratitude to the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries and the Environment Management Authority, EMA, for collaborating with TTBS in the development of this draft standard. I'd also like to thank the Specification Committee for Upstream Effluent Management, which consists of a wide cross-section of stakeholders with technical expertise for this sector. The oil and gas sector in Trinidad and Tobago is one of the largest contributors to gross domestic product, and requirements are necessary for effluent discharges arising from oil and gas operations to ensure sustainability and the protection of the environment. This standard will support the achievement of several United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, including Goal number 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, Goal number 9, Industry, Innovation and Infrastructure, Goal number 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, Goal number 14, Life Below Water, Goal number 15, Life on Land, and Goal number 17, Partnerships for the Goals. The development of this voluntary standard supports TTBS's strategic plan under its National Standardization Strategy and is in alignment with our mandate under the Standards Act, Act number 18 of 1997. Operators of upstream and midstream oil and gas operations are key stakeholders in the implementation of this draft standard. As we continue to align our national effluent discharge limits with international requirements in an attempt to limit the pollution of our marine and onshore environments, we are therefore keen to hear your views on this draft standard. Your feedback is critical, as it will assist TTBS in ensuring that the standard is practical and implementable. In conclusion, I once again extend a special welcome to all of the representatives here today. Your presence emphasizes the fact that all participants, and where applicable, their nominating organizations, continue to play a critical role in the development of national standards and the creation of a standards-conscious society. I wish you a productive and informative session. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Rajkumar.
Thank you, Mr. Ramnath, for those opening remarks and the support of the TTBS in driving the work around this specification committee and benchmarking to international best practice. The next speaker on the agenda is Ms. Nadita Ramchala, She is the manager of standardization division of the TTBS, and she will give us an overview of the mandate of TTBS and the standardization process.
Thank you, Mr. Rajkumar. I will take 1 minute to share my screen.
So while you're sharing, let me introduce you in terms of giving a bio. Ms. Nadita Ramchala is the manager of the standardization division of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards with over 15 years of experience in the development of Trinidad and Tobago standards, mainly in the area of electrical engineering. Mrs. Ramchala was responsible for the formulation of a number of standards in the electrical field, including lighting products, electrical cables and appliances, and the National Electrical Wiring Code, as well as renewable energy systems. She holds a BSc in electrical and computer engineering from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, as well as an MSc degree in project management and a Master's of Business Administration. Her training includes standards development, quality management system, ISO 9001, energy management systems, ISO 5001, as well as the national quality infrastructure development. So I welcome Ms. Nadita Ramchala to give her presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Rajkumar. So I'll go straight into my presentation today. And I know many of the participants may be familiar with TTBS and its operations, but I would just like to recap some of the very critical points. So I'll start off with our governing legislation. TTBS is a national standards body, and we operate under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997. We also have several other roles in our Standards Act. For example, the National Quality Certifying Body, National Laboratory Accreditation Body, and we are also the National Measurement Institute, and this is under the Metrology Act number 18 of 2004. And for TTBS, we have two critical policy and strategy that we use, and that would be the National Quality Policy as well as the National Standardization Strategy. I will touch on the National Standardization Strategy in some later slides, but I encourage all the participants to take a look at the quality policy and look at the concept of national quality infrastructure. So in terms of the vision and mission of TTBS, the vision is to be the central provider of national quality solutions, leading to a standards-conscious society that is globally competitive. The mission, to champion the development and implementation of standards, measurement systems, and conformity assessment services for the competitiveness and sustainability of Trinidad and Tobago. So my next slide would give an illustration of how TTBS is organized at this current time. We have the standardization division being responsible for facilitating national, regional, and international standardization. Again, to mention metrology, we have industrial, scientific, and legal metrology. Essentially, the system here is to ensure that we have accurate measurement systems within the country. To support some of our compulsory standards, we have the implementation division being responsible for inspection at the ports and within the trade itself, so going into businesses, etc. We also have a certification division, and they're responsible for systems such as management system certification, product certification, tourism services certification, and to support the overall role of TTBS in terms of both its mandatory and standards development process. We have a number of laboratories, including chemical, electrical, material, fiber, and textiles. So I would now turn our attention to our standards-related mandate. So we operate under the Standards Act number 18 of 1997, and this outlines the responsibilities of TTBS with regard to the development and maintenance of standards. Generally, standards are developed for the improvement of goods produced or used in the country to ensure industrial efficiency and development, and very critically to promote public and industrial welfare, health and safety, as well as developing standards for the protection of the environment. To facilitate this mandate, we participate at different levels of standardization. So I'll start at the top level. First, we have the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. So you may be familiar with some standards such as ISO 9001 dealing with quality management, or ISO 14001 dealing with environmental management systems. We also have another body the IEC, or the International Electrotechnical Commission, primarily dealing with standardization of electrotechnical areas or electrical products. And there's a third international body, which is the International Telecommunications Union. And this responsibility is coordinated through the Ministry of Public Administration, as well as the Telecommunications Authority, while TTBS handles coordination and facilitating the development of international standards within ISO and IEC. We also have COPANT, which is the regional standards body. So this is the Pan-American Standards Commission, dealing with standards bodies from North America, Latin America, as well as the CARICOM region. And at the sub-regional level, you may be familiar with CROSQ. This is the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality, dealing with harmonization of regional standards to facilitate trade within the CARICOM region. And at the national level, we have TTBS. And to recap, I'm sure many of you all will be familiar with what is a standard, but we would just like to highlight it is a technical document that provides an agreed upon repeatable way of doing something. So standards provide a commonly accepted and repeatable way of defining objective technical requirements of products. And when we say products, we mean both goods and services. So standards can take the form of a specification. It can also take the form of requirements for a particular product or service, but we also have test methods, guidelines, guidance documents, etc. And again, to recap, standards can foster trade, protect public health and safety, preserve the environment, and promote innovation. So I will just go to my next slide just to highlight the types of standards developed by TTBS. And I will start off with the compulsory standards. And these are essentially legislation. So they have the form of technical regulations, and these requirements are legally enforceable by TTBS. And the compulsory status is conferred by the Minister of Trade and Industry. We develop compulsory standards for health, safety, consumer protection, environmental protection. And where there are compulsory standards issued by TTBS, we have the responsibility to enforce. Now, I will now go into the voluntary standards, and today's session is an example of a voluntary standard, and it represents the minimum levels of acceptability for a product or service. They can be adopted at the discretion of business, and they're market-driven. Now, I will also highlight for some voluntary standards, they can be used to support the regulatory framework of another ministry, agency, or division of a ministry. And some examples that we have here would be the different parts of the electrical wiring code. And while it is a voluntary standard for TTBS, it is enforced by the Government Electrical Inspectorate, which falls under the Ministry of Public Utilities. So here we have an example of a voluntary standard being used as part of the regulatory system for electrical safety. So I would go quickly through our standards development process. And we have our national standardization strategy. This is where we have a 3-year work program, so I'll touch on that. But essentially, the need for a standard can be identified by stakeholders. It can also be based on existing standards developed by TTBS. We have received stakeholder requests for different types of standards, and this standard that we're discussing today is one example where we would have received a request to support the upstream effluent policy. And here, where the need is identified and the project has been accepted by the TTBS, we would then initiate a process to conduct technical and market research. Then we'll create a working draft, and this is based on inputs into the process. So for example, existing technical literature, existing standards and regulations. So these type of documents will help us prepare the working draft. And then we will move on to the next stage, our committee stage, where we establish a cross-section of stakeholders. Here we want to ensure that there's a balanced representation of stakeholders who have a vested interest in the development of the voluntary standard. And we would get different views and perspectives from the committee members. When the committee has agreed upon the content of the draft standard, we would then issue for public comment. And this stakeholder consultation is an example where we would consult with a wider stakeholder group or even the general public to get feedback on the draft standard to help us improve the content and ensure that we are developing standards with a high degree of transparency, collaboration, stakeholder input, and ensure that all voices are heard or to enable stakeholders to put their comments into the process. So it is really one of consultation, collaboration for the standards development process, ensuring a high degree of transparency into the process. When we receive comments via stakeholder engagements like this, or even written comments or emailed comments, then we will collate all the comments and again sit down with our specification committee, review the comments, look at the technical justifications for the comments, and then resolve the comments. This means that we will review all the comments and determine what type of changes would be necessary to the draft standard. And when that process has been completed, and this is with the specification committee, we would now submit the draft voluntary standard for approval by our technical and marketing committee. And this is a subcommittee of our board of directors. So our board of directors, they're responsible for declaring all national standards. So our what we call TMC, Technical and Marketing Committee, they would make a recommendation to the overall entire TTBS Board of Directors to approve or declare the standard. And when that process is completed, we move into the publication stage. Now, this standards development process is essentially the same for both voluntary and compulsory standards, but I would like to highlight some of the key differences. The main essential difference is that all compulsory standards, they have to be approved by the Minister of Trade and Industry. I would have highlighted our compulsory standards are essentially type of legislation or technical regulations, and we would use a consultative process to get feedback from manufacturers, importers, or stakeholders that have some type of commercial interest. Because the compulsory standards are part of the regulatory system, we would not use a consensus-based process as for voluntary standards. So within the consensus-based process for voluntary standards, all our committee members would have to agree in the content, and that is at stage 4. And in stage 6, they would also have to agree with how the comments are addressed. For our compulsory standards, essentially, TTBS would determine how comments and feedback from stakeholders would be addressed and agree on the final content. And then we would submit a recommendation to the Minister of Trade and Industry to declare the standard compulsory. So just wanted to highlight the key differences with our compulsory standards versus the voluntary standards. And the main difference being that we develop voluntary standards using a consensus-based process, while for our compulsory standards, we use a consultative process. And very similarly, we would have stakeholder consultations for both types of standards to get feedback from the industry. So I wanted to turn now in terms of the application of standards and our compulsory standards. I mentioned supporting TTBS's regulatory mandate. We have 2 types of compliance systems that we would use. The first being inspections, an inspection scheme. And this is where we would have our inspectors inspect the imported products at the ports or within the trade itself. And for locally manufactured products, we have what we call a product certification scheme. And here you would see an example of the TTS mark being on the product. So our TTBS certification, product certification marks being on the product. And we have some examples of cement or roofing sheets and some other construction products. While for voluntary standards, and voluntary standards in general can be used by industry players, they can be used to support third-party certification. So you may be familiar with ISO 9000, where we have a lot of certified companies. More recently, we would have developed national standards for information security management systems, also occupational health and safety management systems. And this is where these standards can be supported by third-party certification if a company would like to go that far along the compliance process to demonstrate that they have met the requirements of these particular standards. And again, I would mention the voluntary standards such as the electrical wiring code being incorporated into the regulatory schemes of the agencies. So just to highlight again some possible application of voluntary standards, they can be referenced in national policies and contract documents. We have the procurement legislation, so standards can be supporting good procurement practices by reference within those documents, so tender documents, specifications, contracts, etc. As you know, standards are very critical in terms of supporting testing activities. So a number of standards take in the form of test methods. And again, standards being used to support certification such as management systems, product certification, and as well as the accreditation bodies. And here, accreditation dealing with the competence of different types of laboratories. I will go quickly through our national standardization strategy. This is essentially our 3-year program for standards. It is based on an international methodology from ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. TTBS, we would have collected statistical data for the country, and we looked at areas where we can support sectors to improve GDP, look at products that have significant export potential, as well as any environmental, social impacts and supporting government initiatives. And again, we have the example of this particular standard for effluent discharges from upstream and midstream oil and gas operations, supporting a key policy issued by the government. In terms of emerging areas of standardization, this is where we keep abreast of the international trends and try to ensure that our national standardization program also follows or mirrors some of these key areas. So sustainability, we have seen the conclusion of COP27, a lot of issues around sustainability, climate change, net zero being incorporated there. We also have a National Mirror Committee, and this is a mirror committee that mirrors the work of ISO for circular economy, so the development of international standards in the area of circular economy. We recently joined the ISO Technical Committee for Innovation Management, as well as facilities management. So a lot of new and emerging areas that we would like to keep abreast of. So in the interest of national development, we are mirroring the work of the ISO committee, as well as environmental management systems being one of the areas that we would like to reconvene a technical committee on, so that we are on board with the international developments, and then we can bring those best practices and also contribute to the development of the international standards in these areas. So this is the end of my presentation, and if there are any questions, we have a question and answer session. But before I turn the session back to Mr. Rajkumar, it is my pleasure to do his introduction. So thank you, Mr. Rajkumar, for being the moderator for today's session. So I will just go through his bio very quickly. Mr. Rajkumar is the manager of the Technical Services Department at the EME, a position he has held since 2013. He holds a BSc in chemistry and an MPhil in analytical chemistry from the University of the West Indies. He has over 30 years working experience in environmental research and regulatory management. As the manager of technical services, he's responsible for the overall management and administration of several pieces of subsidiary legislation under the Environmental Management Act, including water pollution rules, certificate of environmental clearance rules, noise pollution control rules, environmental sensitive areas and species rules, the air pollution rules, as well as the waste management rules. He presently chairs the Upstream Effluent Management Working Group under the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries that was established in 2020, as well as the TTBS's Specification Committee for Upstream Effluent Management, which we established in 2022 to lead and steer the development of this very important voluntary Trinidad and Tobago standard to support the national development of our country. So it is my pleasure to turn the session back to Mr. Rajkumar. I'm sure that you all are very familiar with him, and he will take us through the overview of the Water Pollution Rules 2019 and the TTS 665 and the interrelation between both documents. So thank you.
Thank you, Nadita, for those introductory remarks. Let me just say, based on your presentation, to thank you for your very comprehensive presentation on the mandate of the TTBS, the standards development process, the distinction between voluntary and compulsory standards, and the linkage between emerging issues and the importance of these standards as we move the country forward. So my presentation today, we're just looking at, for those of you, many of you are familiar with the water pollution rules. So we'll just give a quick review of that and its relationship with these draft standards and how it will be used when it's ultimately determined. Next slide, please. So just to give a little background in terms of the Water Pollution Rules 2019, as some of you may know, the Water Pollution Rules 2001, as amended, was implemented back in 2007 and was implemented up until September of 2019. The Water Pollution Rules were revoked. The 2001 version of the rules were replaced with the 2019 version, primarily due to a legal challenge in the 2001 version on the polluter pays principle. All right, that basically says that you pay as you pollute, right? And the 2001 version had a flat fee, more egalitarian model, as opposed to the PPP, as we call it, the polluter pays principle. So the 2019 version of the rules adopted the polluter pay principle, which basically ensures that water pollution permit fees are proportionate to the amount of pollutants released instead of a flat fee as previously determined. It also promotes recycling and reuse, and this is in keeping with the circularity of economies moving forward. It manages both point and non-point sources. It utilizes an integrated approach to watershed improvement plans when facilities may have are meeting the end of pipe standards, but the ambient water quality in the environment is not attained. So you have to move towards water quality-based approaches. Next slide. So this just gives an overview of how the water pollution process operates at present. So facilities will be notified for the need to apply for a water pollution permit by the authority. The EMA would review those applications and the data provided and determine if there's exceedance to the schedules 1 and 2. The permit will be issued to the facility for a period of not exceeding 5 years. And if the facility would be checked for compliance with the conditions in the permit, and if the facility is compliant with Schedule 2 at the end of that permit, and as I said before, if there is still non-attainment of ambient standards in that particular region or watershed, we will move to something what we call the watershed improvement plans to further improve the quality of the receiving environment. Next slide, please. So those of you familiar will know that there are 3 schedules in the Water Pollution Rules 2019. Previously, the previous version had 2 schedules, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Schedule 1 determines what is considered a water pollutant, and Schedule 2 is the end of pipe standards for 4 different receiving environments with a listing of 28 parameters. Those schedules are basically unchanged from the 2001 version. However, WPR 2019 introduces ambient water quality standards and the linkage, as I mentioned before, in terms of the watershed improvement plans. Next slide. So we see this draft, these voluntary standards that is being discussed today. The intended users will be upstream and midstream operators in the oil and gas sector, and it's the overall objective of reducing pollution footprint. All right, Nadita mentioned the recent outcome of the COP27 in Egypt, and the SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, environmental social safeguards and governance. It's all about that in terms of having sectors continuously improve their processes and reducing our both carbon footprint and pollution footprint. It will also be utilized by the regulatory agencies to mainstream the UEM policy objectives in permits and licenses. The overall objective of the UEM policy, which will be this, which Mr. Rudder from the Ministry of Energy will go into some detail in terms of highlighting the objectives of the UEM policy that has been approved and the overarching principle of zero harmful discharge, again in keeping with reducing pollution footprint and benchmarking to international best practice. This voluntary standard covers the major waste streams from the upstream and midstream, produced water, hydrotest water, drill cuttings, and workover fluids. And the linkages in terms of the EMA as being a regulator would be for ensuring that to utilize the standards, the voluntary standard when they are ultimately finalized and passed, is to utilize the technical requirements therein to consider those in developing, whether we talk about water pollution permits under the water pollution rules or conditions for CECs, that certificate of environmental clearance for proposed operations. So it's basically to utilize the technical requirements to include on a case-by-case basis and its relevance in these permits, whether you're talking about water pollution permits or certificated environmental clearance permits and conditions. Next slide. So essentially that is my presentation, and I will now, as I said before, we have a questions and answer session. So you can hold your questions for that session. The next presenter is Ms. Beverly Moore, who's the Standards Officer of the Standardization Division in TTBS. Beverly will give us a presentation on the proposed requirements of the draft standard, or the voluntary standard that we are talking about. And let me introduce Beverly. Ms. Beverly Monroe is a Senior Standards Officer in the Standards Division of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards and is responsible for chemical portfolio, garments, and textiles. She has a BSc in Chemistry and a Master's degree in Business Administration and a Bachelor of Laws degree. She has worked both in the Implementation and Standardization Division of the TTBS and has experience in both conformity assessment and standardization activities. So let me welcome Ms. Monroe to give us an overview of the proposed standards. So Beverly, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajkumar. Please confirm that you can see my presentation.
Yes, we are seeing.
Okay, thank you very much. So good morning to everyone. Today I'll give you an overview of the proposed voluntary standard, TTS 665, effluent discharges from upstream and midstream oil and gas operations. And I will tell you about the background to the standard, the scope of the standard, key requirements, key milestones, and public comment period. And I will also identify the main benefits of this voluntary standard. So as you would have heard from Mr. Rajkumar, the standard was requested by the Working Group for Upstream Effluent Management under the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. And this standard will support the implementation of the Upstream Effluent Management Policy. And you will hear more about that policy from Mr. Mark Rudder in his presentation. So TTBS would have established a specification committee for upstream effluent management. And this committee comprised a wide cross-section of stakeholders. And this committee was charged with the responsibility of drafting the requirements of this standard. And at this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the members of the committee for contributing towards the development of this document. As you can see here, we have many stakeholders represented on the committee. We have the Environmental Management Authority, and of course, Mr. Rajkumar is the chairman of the committee. We have representatives from the University of the West Indies, Institute of Marine Affairs, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, the Society of Petroleum Engineers of Trinidad and Tobago, the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, the Ministry of Planning and Development, Tobago House of Assembly, Council for the Presidents of the Environment, the Association of Upstream Operators of Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, we have representatives from TTBS, and I am the technical secretary to the committee. So who are the intended users of this document? Well, we have the upstream and midstream operators in the oil and gas sector. We also have the testing bodies that will be integrally involved in testing effluent discharges. And we have the regulators. And when I speak about regulators, I mean the Environmental Management Authority and the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, which can reference the voluntary standard in their licensing and permitting frameworks at their discretion. And you would have heard from Mr. Rajkumar as how the EMA will be utilizing the document. So what is the scope of this draft standard? This standard establishes effluent discharge limitations with relevant test methods for key pollutant parameters related to end-of-pipe effluent discharges from upstream and midstream industrial establishments involved in oil and gas, natural gas operations. These include onshore and offshore sources located within Trinidad and Tobago. And just to provide some clarification with definitions, so upstream means operations of the petroleum industry involving exploration and production. Midstream means operations of the petroleum industry involving storage, handling, and transportation. And when we speak of industrial establishments, we speak of factories, shops, offices, places of work, or other premises. And let's move on to some key requirements now. And let's start with produced water. So what is produced water? It's water that is brought up from the hydrocarbon-bearing strata during the extraction of oil and gas. And here we have two parameters for produced water: oil and grease, and total petroleum hydrocarbon. And we've included these two parameters because they can have an adverse impact on aquatic life if they are released in excessive amounts. And also to mention, in order to assess these two parameters, we can use the EPA test method 1664, which is the N-hexene extractable material, oil and grease extraction, and gravimetry. Right? If you look at the requirements for onshore, there's no discharge to the environment. And you're probably asking, why are these requirements so stringent where there's no discharge to the environment? Well, the intention of the standard is to raise the bar for the industry to ensure adequate protection of the environment. So we want to ensure that toxic chemicals don't find their way into the natural water courses, and they will obviously have a negative impact on animals and plants and any terrestrial environments. Right? So throughout the documents, you will see the trend that there's no discharge to the onshore environment. However, the discharge to the offshore environment is permitted. So for oil and grease, the maximum for any 1 day shall not exceed 42 milligrams per liter. The average of daily values for 30 consecutive days shall not exceed 29 milligrams per liter. And for total petroleum hydrocarbon, the maximum for any 1 day shall not exceed 42 milligrams per liter. And the average of daily values for 30 consecutive days shall not exceed 25 milligrams per liter. Now, the limits that are contained within the draft standard are benchmarked against a number of documents. So we would have used the US EPA regulations, 40 CFR Part 435, oil and gas point source category. We would have also used the World Bank group document that is entitled Environmental Health and Safety Guidelines for Offshore Oil and Gas Development. And we would have also benchmarked against the Water Pollution Rules 2019 under the EME. All right, next up we have water-based drilling fluids and drill cuttings. So water drilling fluids, they are liquids, gaseous fluid, and mixtures of fluids and solids used in operations to drill boreholes into the earth. And what are the drill cuttings? They are soil, rock fragment, and pulverized material which are removed from a borehole and which may include a minimal amount of fluid resulting from the drilling process. And the majority of the definitions that you would see in the draft standard were referenced from the upstream effluent management policy. Right, so here again, onshore, no discharge to the environment. And we have requirements for water-based drilling fluid, suspended particulate phase, which is SPP, toxicity. And the offshore requirement is a minimum 96-hour LC50 of the toxicity test at 3% by volume. So what do we mean by LC50? It's a lethal concentration, which is the concentration at which 50% of the test organisms die in a 96-hour test period. And the test sample solution is a minimum of 3% by volume. Free oil, no discharge to the environment. We have also included requirements for mercury and cadmium because we recognize that these are systemic toxicants, and if they get into the food chain, they can cause multiple organ damage. So we wanted to safeguard against that, and we included requirements for both mercury and cadmium. So mercury, the maximum dry weight will be 1 milligram per kilogram in stock barite, and for cadmium, 3 milligrams per kilogram in stock barite. Moving on to non-aqueous drilling fluids and drill cuttings. And as you can see, these are similar requirements to the water-based drilling fluids and drill cuttings. So the parameters are the same. Again, onshore, no discharge to the environment. And again, offshore, similar parameters. So 96-hour LC50, 3% by volume. Mercury, a maximum of 1 milligram per kilogram dry weight in the stock barite. And for the cadmium, a maximum of 3 milligram per kilogram dry weight in the stock barite. Workover fluids. So workover fluids are well-controlled fluids, typically a brine, which is used during workover operations. And we have here a number of parameters for the workover fluids. Again, the onshore environment, there's no discharge. And for the offshore, for oil and grease, the maximum for any 1 day shall not exceed 42. And the average of daily values for 30 consecutive days shall not exceed 29 milligrams per liter. We have included a requirement for pH units as 6 to 9 because we don't want the discharge to be too alkaline or too acidic. And so we have included a neutral pH here, which is benchmarked against the water pollution rules. We included the SPP toxicity again at 96-hour LC50, 3% by volume. And here we have the total petroleum hydrocarbon, which is a maximum for any 1 day shall not exceed 42 milligrams per liter, and the average of daily values for 30 consecutive days shall not exceed 25 milligrams per liter. Right, now we move on to hydrotest water. And what is hydrotest water? It is water and chemicals which will be placed in pipelines, tanks, etc., and raised to greater than atmospheric pressure in order to check for leaks or the structural integrity of these facilities. So we have requirements for both offshore and onshore hydrotest water. So here there's a choice. So with respect to discharges of hydrotest water, you can either send onshore for treatment and disposal, or you can conduct environmental risk analysis and careful selection of chemicals before discharging offshore in accordance with the requirements of the National Competent Authority to ensure zero harmful discharges. And when we speak of zero harmful discharges, we mean discharges where a risk-based case-by-case evaluation shows that the discharge will not cause any harm to the receiving environment. And again, we have requirements here for the hydrotest water. For the onshore application, there shall be no discharge of hydrotest water to the onshore environment unless authorized by the National Competent Authority. And of course, the authorities, the EMA and the Ministry of Energy, can determine if these can be released into the onshore environment on a case-by-case basis at their discretion, as previously mentioned. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about the key milestones for this standard. So a need was identified, and then in June 2022, we would have prepared the working draft standard. And then the specification committee for upstream effluent management was established in July. And that committee would have reviewed the working draft standard and prepared a committee draft standard during the period July to October 2022. And then this standard would have been advertised for public comment during the period November 2022 until January 2023. And right now we are in the process of soliciting feedback on this draft standard. And here we are at the stakeholder consultation. So the purpose of this consultation is to solicit feedback on the document. So we would really appreciate if you can give us your comments, your questions, your recommendations, your improvements, with the intention of finalizing the draft standard. And we'll take all your comments on board, and then the specification committee will review the comments and determine which additional requirements should be included in the standard based on your comments, and we'll do that in January. And just to mention, the deadline for comments is the 6th of January 2023, so feel free to email me all of your comments until that period, and of course I'll share with you my email address. And in February 2023, TTBS, we will seek approval from the TTBS's Board of Directors. And in March 2023, the legal notice of declaration will be gazetted and the draft standard will now be published. And then you can purchase the document for a nominal cost from our web store on our website, which is gottbs.com. So the public comment period, so the standard is currently in the public comment period of the standards development process. We would have printed some ads in our newspapers, so the Guardian, the Newsday, the Express. We had printed ads on 3 days from the 31st of October to the 2nd of November, sorry. We would have advertised the standard on our social media platforms, including Facebook and also on the TTBS's website. And here we are hosting the consultation, and the deadline for comments is the 6th of January. So what are the main benefits of this voluntary standard? Well, the standard was developed to establish limits for the monitoring of harmful pollutants to the offshore environment, to support the implementation of the upstream effluent management policy, to support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, and this is goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. And it does support other UN Sustainable Development Goals like life on land, clear water and sanitation, etc. And also to promote the goal of zero harmful discharge to the onshore and offshore environments. So please email me all your comments. My email address is beverly.monroe@ttbs.org.tt. The deadline for comments is the 6th of January 2023. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And we look forward to discussing all your comments in the Q&A session later on today. Thank you so much. Back to you, Mr. Rajkumar.
So thank you very much, Beverly, for your comprehensive presentation in terms of giving us the makeup of the committee, the milestones, the benefits, and the need for this raising the bar, so to speak, for Trinidad and Tobago. The next presenter is Mr. Mark Rudder. Mark is the Petroleum Operations Director in the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industry. Mark will give us an overview of the UEM policy and how it will be utilized when it's finally approved in the ministry. So Mr. Mark Rudder is currently a Petroleum Operations Director at the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. He has been working at the ministry for the past 25 years. He was appointed as a chair to the cabinet-appointed Upstream Effluent Management Committee to develop the UEM policy for Trinidad and Tobago, which was approved by cabinet in 2019. Mr. Rudder is a graduate of the University of the West Indies with a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics and a Master's of Science in Petroleum Engineering. He holds a Master's degree, a Master of Science in Geography and Environmental Engineering from the Johns Hopkins University. So I now invite Mr. Rudder to give us his presentation on the UEM policy.
Thank you, Mr. Rajkumar. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I will go into a little bit about the UEM policy that was developed by a committee of cabinet, and a little bit also about how we plan to implement the standard, the voluntary standard. Try to remain within my allotted time frame. So the presentation outline, we go through a background of the UEM policy, the reason for the policy, the need for it, the purpose of the policy, an overview of the effluent management strategies and objectives, outlining the policy, and then the implementation of the UEM policy. And then the question and answer period will follow after my presentation. So as an introduction, the UEM policy is a regulatory tool used to ensure minimization and ultimate elimination of treated and untreated effluent, upstream effluent discharge through an integrated management approach. The strategies detailed under the specific objectives are also intended to prioritize the actions required by the various stakeholders and their roles and responsibilities for implementation of this policy. Just to give a background, in terms of policy, normally when we go into developing of new regulations, new standards, it is the intention to get the government's take and approval. And normally the mechanism to do so is through a policy, and hence the reason why we develop the policy first, and then all the other regulatory instruments will be developed afterwards. So this is basically the background for what we're talking about here in terms of this voluntary standard, which supports it. This is a brief history of the development of the UEM policy. As mentioned, it was approved by cabinet in 2019. The cabinet appointed committee was developed in 2017, but there was a lot of other work that was taking place prior to 2017 when this cabinet appointed committee was developed. A lot of discussions amongst the operators and the regulatory agencies, mainly the EMA and the Ministry of Energy, over probably about 3 or 5 year period. And then subsequent to that, there was a major workshop that took place in 2015, hosted by the Society of Petroleum Engineers at the Hyatt. That was in November 2015, which catalyzed the development of this UEM committee, which developed the UEM policy. Finally approved by cabinet in 2017. The policy was developed by 2018, and it took some time for cabinet to approve it. It went through FNGP committee as well of cabinet prior to final approval by cabinet in 2019. So the need for the UEM policy, the number of issues that were raised, especially by the operators and also the agencies, the inability to meet some of the permissible discharge standards of the second schedule of the Water Pollution Rules 2001, limited best practicable environmental options, treatment technologies, lack of ambient water quality standards for Trinidad and Tobago, lack of adequate information on toxicity of raw formation water versus produced water, a lack of knowledge of the cumulative impacts of upstream effluents, a limited number of local laboratories capacity. So that was the purpose of the UN policy, to chart a way forward to enable more efficient and effective regulation and compliance with legislative provisions towards the advancement of a sustainable energy industry. So the aims and objectives of the policy identify the specific areas for legislative reform, promote and encourage greater use of environmental best practices, including best available technology, with focus on zero harmful discharge to the environment, facilitate effective regulation of upstream effluents, encourage the development of human resource and technical capacity, and provide a framework for the increased application of science and technology within UEM, and achieve and maintain a level of sustainability that is required for the oil and gas industry, and in effect, that is in keeping with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of policy and administration of the UN policy, the Ministry of Energy, as directly arm for the energy sector, ensures that licensees are in compliance with the Petroleum Act and legislation, subsidiary legislation, specifically Regulation 42 of the Petroleum Regulations. And the EMAs manages effluents under the CEC rules and the water pollution rules. And also we saw that the TTBS also establishes standards for protection of the environment through the Standards Act, number 18 of 1997. So those were the three main arms that we saw that we could effect the UN policy through regulatory instruments. And as we speaking about today, we're talking about the voluntary standard as developed through the TTBS. As mentioned in previous presentations today, the focus for the UN policy was these effluent streams: produced water, drilling fluids, workover fluids, completion fluids, hydrotest water, and also drill cuttings. All right. I wouldn't go into the definitions of these terms because they were already discussed earlier, but my presentation does have a definition, which I'll go through I will just skip those slides. So these were the focus of areas that we had. The main effluent that we looked at was, of course, produced water, which is the major effluent produced by oil and gas industry. Under the UN policy, all effluents require legislative reform of the following. So amendment of the effluent, significant effluent of the industrial processes discharged into the environment, the TTS 547 of 1998, and water pollution rules. So we saw that as needing some amendments, which we are talking about here today, about the amendment of the TTBS standard. Or, well, actually, there's a new standard, which will supersede the former standard. Amendment of the water pollution rules, which that was what we said in the terms of the policy. Amendment of the water pollution rules referring to the TTS 547 standard, was amended or changed accordingly, and include reporting requirements for type and volume of chemical waste produced and disposal methods utilized, inclusive on-site treatment and disposal of the waste, produced waste management rules. Right, the EMA would have discussed earlier in terms of how they plan to implement the new standard. In terms of the Ministry of Energy, as mentioned or hinted, the Ministry of Energy intends to implement the voluntary standard through its approval processes. For instance, maybe approvals of drilling permits, approval of hydrotest permits, approval of chemicals used in industry. And then in future, we may also look at amendments to the regulations, drone regulations as mentioned. And also we could also include reference to the standard in licensing in terms of updating licenses with companies. Right, the easier way would be to do it through the approval process as well as through the licensing mechanism. Legislative reform takes some time, so that will probably be in terms of medium term to long term, in terms of amendments to legislation. I won't go into the definition of produced water, but in terms of the strategies as outlined in the policy, deal with produced water, to promote the use of best practicable environmental options, treatment technologies that are capable of meeting end-of-pipe limits for existing facilities, ensure standardization of the evaluation and assessment criteria in order to trigger measures which would improve the comparability and harmonization of procedures, conduct audits of produced water treatment systems as part of regular inspections, require that operators provide an assessment of potential chronic and acute effects and risks to the aquatic environment, biotic and abiotic, of their long-term produced water discharge, encourage the identification and use of appropriate indicator species for toxicity testing, and support the Ministry responsible for the environment and relevant research institutions on the development of national ambient water quality standards. This is the definition of heritage water, and in terms of the strategies to deal with heritage water, to prohibit the disposal of heritage water into shallow coastal waters and sensitive ecosystems, establish and enforce standards and criteria for disposal of heritage water into the onshore and offshore environments, require monitoring during a specified sample period when heritage water is discharged to ensure compliance with relevant effluent limitations, and require vendors seeking chemical approvals to conduct LC50 testing at the relevant uses concentration. In terms of drilling fluids, the objectives and strategies as outlined in the policy to deal with this is to prohibit the discharge of whole synthetic base muds and oil-based muds into the marine environment, require testing of drilling fluids prior to and after use to ensure compliance with approved toxicity limits, develop and implement a code of practice, establish and enforce standards and criteria for disposal of the drilling fluids into the offshore environment, and develop a formal process for evaluating and monitoring the human health and environmental risks of chemicals imported and utilized in Trinidad and Tobago, modeled after the CHARM or similar systems for evaluating chemical risks. So this CHARM method is a chemical hazard assessment and risk management system that is used in Europe, which we mentioned in the policy as a similar system that we could use here in Trinidad to evaluate human health and environmental risks, especially the chemicals used in the drilling fluids. Workover and completion fluids, the objectives and strategies outlined in the policy are these: promote the use of best available techniques and best environmental practices for treatment and disposal of workover and completion fluids, prohibit the use of zinc bromide brine, which is a highly toxic chemical, develop and implement a code of practice and ensure that approval is not granted for use of chemicals with individual and/or cumulative toxicities above EMA recommended levels, unless there is an acceptable means of disposal treatment prior to any discharge. And in terms of drill cuttings, the objectives and strategies, develop a formal standardized practices for safe disposal of drill cuttings in the marine environment, establish minimum standards for quality of input waste materials sent to treatment and disposal sites, ensure toxicity testing of drill cuttings and compliance with retention of oil and cutting standards before discharge into marine environment, prohibit the discharge of oil-based muds associated with cuttings in an offshore environment, and it's developed guidelines for the treatment of synthetic waste muds and oil-based muds retained on drill cuttings. Coming down to the end now, in terms of implementation of the UN policy, the recommendation that came from the committee was to create mechanisms for compliance with the UN policy and existing environmental legislation, strengthen institutional arrangements and collaboration among stakeholders, and improve national environmental data and information management, sorry. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And the next section that we come to now is the question and answer period, which will be moderated by Ms. Shalini Gopi. I'll give the introduction for her and then she'll take over after me. Ms. Shalini Gopi has more than 12 years experience in the energy sector. She currently works at the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries as the Senior Environmental Officer. She also serves in various national environmental committees, including the National Council for Sustainable Development as chairperson for the Waste Management Priority Area. And she's a member of the Upstream Effluent Management Working Group. Ms. Shalini Gopi has a BSc in Environmental and Natural Resource Management and an MSc in Biodiversity and Conservation and in Sustainable Development. She's also a registered environmental professional at the Institute of Environmental Science in London. So I'll now turn you over to Ms. Shalini Gopi. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Rana. Okay, so I'm going to open the Q&A session for this consultation. And I'd also like to introduce the list of panelists together with the presenters. So we have Dr. Beverly Chitu, Senior Instructor, University of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Denise Beckles, Senior Lecturer at the University of West Indies, Dr. Darrell Banju, Acting Director of the Institute Marine Affairs, Ms. Babita Dubé, Chemical and Environmental Engineer at Society of Petroleum Engineers of Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, so we already have a few questions that came in during the presentation, and I'm going to take them in order that it was received. First question was, they did not see any provision for gaseous emissions from the industry, either from evaporation or fugitive or intentional releases such as flaring and stack emissions. Is this to be included in a separate standard? These two are intertwined and, more importantly, have implications for climate change mitigation actions and public health. Consider this is a circular economy principle application to this sector. Mr. Rajkumar, would you like to take this question?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. As Mark would have reiterated, the UEM policy would have set the parameters and the outline for development of the various activities. The UEM policy specifically mentioned liquid effluent, management of liquid effluent. Now, the question talked about looking at the gaseous emissions, all right? So while we welcome the comment in this particular effluent standard, that is this voluntary standard requirements, it may not be the appropriate place for this, but certainly the comment could be taken and we look in terms of whether or not a similar type of technical requirement to deal with discharges from the oil and emissions from the oil and gas sector. But I could also mention that there's already the air pollution rules that is in train that will deal with emissions from all types of industry, including oil and gas sector. I don't know if that answers the question from the representative.
Okay.
Is there any feedback?
No feedback, so we'll just move on to the next question. Also from the same person, limitations and guidelines for the use of oil-based drill and mud, guidelines for appropriate disposal of such. I suppose this is regard to the standards. Mr. Rajkumar, also want to address this?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, exactly as worded. To be addressed, limitations and guidelines for the use of oil-based drill and muds, guidelines for appropriate disposal of such. If it's, do you wish for me to open the mic Irma, would you like to ask the question and clarify?
Let me just say that any disposal of hazardous waste or toxic waste or waste in general will be covered under the existing, the fairly recent waste management rules that was passed and been implemented. So that is one answer to the question, but certainly the voluntary standard does set some technical requirements for the criteria to be met for any releases and prohibition of certain releases and certain receiving in an onshore environment.
Okay. See no additional comments. Let's move on to the next question. For offshore installation, which operates constantly, why was not sanitary discharge limited included in this standard? Mr. Rajkumar?
As I said previously, we already have the Water Pollution Rules 2019, right? So that is the national standard that applies to all different sectors and all different waste streams, right? So that will be covered under the Water Pollution Rules 2019. This voluntary standard is to work in concert and to complement the water pollution rules and to ensure there's no conflict, right? And as I said before, we consider these technical requirements when they're finally approved, when we are reviewing and approving and developing conditions in permits and certificates. Yes.
Okay. Next question. Does the voluntary standard differentiate between nearshore marine water and offshore marine water? If yes, how are they defined? Sorry, Mr. Rajkumar. I don't know if anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, the other members could answer as well. But
Dr. Andrew as well?
Yes, thanks very much. That's an excellent question. And in our definition, in terms of definition 3.8, we indicated that onshore refers to that situated on land and including coastal nearshore. So that is our definition in terms of including nearshore as part of the onshore. And we do have a definition for the offshore in 3.9. And these definitions is also benchmarked against the existing water pollution rules that clearly indicates the difference between coastal nearshore and offshore. I don't know if that gives the clarification. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, next question. I understand that the UEM policy would have focused on specific effluents that were highlighted in the presentations. However, would the objective of focusing on the zero harm discharge be applied to sanitary water effluent as well? Mr. Rodder, would you like to take this question?
Okay, I would try to answer the question. In terms of the UAM policy was dealing with liquids, it was effluents, and we looked at zero harmful discharge in the context of effluents, all right? However, in terms of solid waste, we decided not to stay very clear away from solid because it wasn't the mandate of the committee to look at solids. Although we did look at cuttings, which we consider solid, but we focused mainly on the liquid component, how do you use liquid component on the cuttings. So it deals with the retention of oil in the cuttings. So it wasn't really contemplated at that time to look at zero harmful discharge applied to sanitary waste, but I suppose it's something we could look at in the future. So I think we could probably table it and look at it as a possibility for something. It may not be considered as part of this UEM policy or even implementation, but I think it's something we could look at in terms of sanitary waste in a future policy document appropriate for that.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a next question that just came in. Any local consideration by fishermen or individuals living near effluent discharge sites such as Point Lisas? Any consideration to use of satellite digital data to follow up on effluent drainage patterns concerning ecological damage? Any biofuel production consideration such as algae cultures at Gulf effluent discharge points? Are these considered in the policy? Dr. Banju?
Yes, thanks so much for the excellent question. With respect to the first question, it deals with, the first question, could you repeat the first question again? Okay. I just lost my train of thoughts.
Okay. Any local consideration by fishermen or individuals living near effluent drainage sites? Any consideration to use satellite digital data to follow up on effluent drainage patterns concerning ecological drainage?
Right. Well, with respect to the sensitive sites in terms of fisher folks and effluent discharge, this, in terms of the standard, this is indicated clearly that there would be no discharge. So the expectation in the standard that there will be no discharge to the onshore and near coastal area. In terms of the monitoring capabilities in terms of discharge, presently, apart from the standard that the Ministry of Energy and in the IMA, we are installing radars to detect pollutant in terms of monitoring. In terms of other types of effluent, such as like algal blooms, the IMA does have a monitoring program to monitor to indicate the state of the environment, of which we produce a state of the environment report. I don't know if that answered the question, but we are open to take these questions to provide further answers. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. I think you also addressed the second part of the question as well. Yes, we can confirm that answered the question. Okay, we have another question. Has consideration been given to the inclusion / comparison to MARPOL's requirements for offshore installation? Would the requirements of this standard be extended to the MODUs? Mr. Rudder? You want me to repeat the question?
I see the question. I think when we were developing the policy, we were looking at various standards. We may have looked at MARPOL as part of the process of developing the policy. But in terms of these requirements for modules, yes, it is designed for discharges from oil and gas operations in the offshore environment primarily. All right, that was the intent of the main intent of the policy. So it would look at modules as well. Yes, once there's any effluents discharges from modules in the offshore environment, yes, it should look at that as well.
Okay.
All right, and the thing about it is that I mean there are MARPOL standards, but we looked at we were looking at it particularly from an oil and gas unique effluents that we get from oil and gas sector. All right, and MARPOL looks at oil and gas, but they also look at shipping, and that as you mean trust, but they do look at modules as well. But Yes, that is we were looking at it primarily also from an oil and gas operations point of view, drilling, workovers, production. That was the main focus. Whereas MARPOL, they may look at that, but they're not looking at the unique features like, for instance, hydro testing of pipelines and so on. All right, so we're a little more unique to just the energy sector in our focus.
Okay, great. Thank you. I do not see any questions, any further questions coming in at this time. If anybody interested in asking a question, I could just raise your hand. I could unmute you.
Shalini, just to say that we have, I'm seeing 46 participants. We had 75 registered bodies. So we have a fairly good participation for today's session, just to make that point there.
Okay, great. And another thing to note, any questions following up after this session, feel free to email and we will respond to you, because once you're registered, we have your contact information, so we could send you any clarifications you may have. Okay, we have another question. Can we look at independent research for pollutants in the Gulf as well as consult private results data and enhance voluntary standards to regulate the results? Ms. Moore, would you like to take a stab at this?
I would prefer to defer to Mr. Rajkumar.
Okay.
Good. Shalini, could you repeat the question? I didn't get the question.
Can we look at independent research for pollutants in the Gulf as well as consult private results data and enhance voluntary standards to regulate the results?
Certainly, if there is data information that it comes to any of the regulatory bodies that comes from not necessarily the polluters or the operators or the laboratories for which they are contracted to provide work. If we have information from independent sources, certainly the authorities would look at that data and review it for its relevance and reliability and authenticity and those kinds of things. So certainly, if that information crosses that bar in terms of it meets those thresholds and it shows something, it will be investigated. Yeah.
Okay, great. We have another question. What was the criteria used to identify and select the effluents of focus in the UEM policy? Mr. Rodder?
Okay, so the main area of concern by the operators and of course the regulators was produced water. So the intention was to look at produced water alone. However, when we met in the committee, the name of the committee was Upstream Effluent Management. So we decided to look at all the relevant effluents, not just produced water, and hence we looked at all the streams, effluent, liquid effluent streams from oil and gas operations. So that was the catalyst first, looking at the other areas that they have effluents besides produced water, for instance, hydrotest water, completion operations, workover operations. So look at the operations of the oil and gas sector offshore and all the effluent streams, and that was the catalyst for choosing the effluents that we will focus on. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thank you. I am not seeing any more questions at the moment. Just give a couple minutes just in case anybody's typing. Okay, there don't seem to be any more questions. All right then, if there's no more questions, we have had a pretty efficient meeting so far. I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Ramnath to give closing remarks. Oh, and there's also a feedback form. Please, if all members could fill it out, that'd be very helpful. The link is in the chat.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gopi. So in closing, I'd just like to say, on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, I would like to thank, first of all, Mr. Wayne Rajkumar for chairing the specification committee for upstream effluent management and moderating today's session. I would also like to say thanks to Mr. Mark Rudder for his presentation. We would also like to thank Ms. Shalini Gopi for competently moderating the Q&A session this afternoon. Sincere gratitude to all of the panelists who would have responded to technical questions, including Dr. Banju, Ms. Dubé, Dr. Beckles, and Dr. Chitu. In addition, we would also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to all the members of the specification committee who volunteered their time and expertise towards the development of the draft standard. Last, but certainly not least, we extend special thanks to all of the stakeholders who would have participated in today's event. We have noted all of the comments, and please continue to email your comments to Ms. Beverly Monroe until 6 January 2023. At this point, I would like to thank the Standardization Division of TTBS for a successful consultation, and I bring the session to a close. Do have a wonderful and productive day, everyone.